Hello, everybody. This is Seth. Welcome back again to the Travel Smith Co. podcast. We are right in the middle of our series called The Journey, discussing everything that you would need to know and do, some ideas of ways to prepare, travel, enjoy the time while you're on the trip, and return, all in one series. So we are right in the middle of that. Today, we are going to be talking about entering into a new culture or living like a local, as I like to describe it. So as we discuss this today, the first step is really a mindset shift or a way to be thinking before you even get there. And so that is just to remember, even as you are boarding the plane, if not before, that you are not in your home country anymore. So whenever you are traveling, you don't have the rules, regulations, protections, hindrances, whatever it might be of the place that you're leaving. You're entering into a new culture, a new country, a place with new rules, cultural norms, expectations, and it is different than where you are coming from. So just keep that in mind even before you are traveling, that wherever you're going, your constitutional rights or whatever rules and social norms that you are leaving, well, you're leaving those. And so just keeping in mind that you are going to a new place, you're going there to be a guest and be a good guest. And so that is really the first step, I believe, is to have that mind shift, thinking through, how can I be a good guest? How can I apply myself in this new place with these new rules and just learn about this culture? If you're wanting to live like a local, figure out some basic ideas, knowing what language is spoken, maybe learning a few words of that if it's possible. If it's not possible, you might also be able to figure out just a few things once you're there. There have been times where I have gone on a trip that I didn't really have the time to try to learn any basic greetings, or saying thank you is a really good word to know. Maybe I didn't have time beforehand, but I was able to kind of figure out once I got there, just observing the culture, seeing what people say to each other whenever you do a courtesy for them. If you see someone hold the door for someone else and everybody that has the door held for them says the same word or phrase, there's a good chance that that is some type of thank you. So either learning a few words beforehand or figuring out a few as you are going can be a really good way to show a little respect for that culture, to be able to acclimate yourself to that. Also thinking through, is this new culture I'm going into, is it a night culture? Is it a day culture? How do people act? When do they do things? Do they do things early, late? There are times where I have been in spots where maybe people don't go out until 10 p.m. And then there's times where all of the grocery stores shut down at 4:30 or 5 in the afternoon. So if you want to buy groceries, you have to do that before the evening. So just figuring out, is this a night culture? Is this a day culture? Do people walk everywhere? Do they take local transit? Do they drive? How do they get around? Any other signs of respect or greetings to use if you want to greet somebody in the street in a kind and culturally appropriate way? Or maybe you shouldn't greet everyone in the street. And also keeping in mind, are there any normal things that I would say or do in my culture that might be offensive or just make me stand out more in this culture? Whether that's greeting somebody you don't know, or any signs, greetings, or any other things like that, just to make yourself as polite and as good of a guest as possible when you are getting ready to enter a new culture. So once you are there, what I really recommend doing, if you have the ability to do this, is to find a local friend. Maybe it is just somebody that is nearby where you're staying. Maybe you already know somebody that's there, but find a local cafe, a local market, a local restaurant, a neighbor, sit down, spend time with them, eat a meal, get coffee, drink some tea, whatever the culturally appropriate thing to do in that situation is. Spend some time with some locals. So I had a time, one of the spots I was staying for a few months, I frequented a sandwich shop and went there often enough. By the time I had been there a few weeks, I would go into this sandwich shop and the guys would say, "Oh, do you want chicken or fish today?" Because they knew what I would order, and so they would just knew it was going to be one of these two options. So we just sit and have some small talk for a little bit. But I went there enough, they got to know me a little bit. And so I was the only foreigner who would often go into this sandwich shop. And so they kind of got to know me a little bit and just got to spend some time with them. Another time, I had some neighbors who were working across the street from the apartment I was staying in. And I just spent some time with them. I got to hang out with them. I got to sit down. They invited me to come and eat with them while they were working a time or two. And just sitting and spending time with them, sharing a meal with them. It's a really cool way to experience a culture, get to know people, even if it's something as basic as where you get your hair cut. I had a time living in the Middle East where I went to a barber. I went to him on a regular basis, was there for a good while, and then I moved away, and I came back to visit a couple years later and went back to see if he was still in business. And he was so excited to see me. He recognized me even a couple years later, recognized me as the foreign guy who used to come to him. He actually was closing his shop whenever I showed up, but he saw me. He opened his shop back up just so he could give me another haircut and spend some time with me and talk with me. So just embrace this idea of becoming a local somewhere, not in the touristy parts of town, but finding a local shop, get to meet some local people, spend time with them, and figure out, hey, what do the locals like to do? How can I become a local somewhere that is local and learn about the culture in this way? Even if you can't necessarily make a friend, if you don't have the time to develop that relationship, ask local people where to go and what to do. Don't necessarily ask, what is a good place to eat, but where would you go eat? So if you, depending on where you're at, if you say, hey, what's a good place to eat? They might tell you, hey, this is where all of the foreigners like to go, or this is where the tourists like to go. And usually tourist traps don't have good food. But if you ask a local person, where do you like to eat? A lot of times it's going to be both cheaper and a better quality food and much more authentic than you would get if you were next to a tourist trap. You might only have to go a few blocks away from tourist trap areas to find much better food at a much better price. So went to Rome a few years ago, and all across the main streets, there are coffee shops, there are restaurants, there are all of these things. We actually had done a little research and found a coffee shop that was maybe 4 or 5 blocks away and went into it. It was just significantly cheaper and so much better quality, both with the pastries and with the coffee, that we just kept going back to that spot. It was a few blocks out of the way, but it's where the locals went. And so look around and see, are the customers coming here, are they mostly local or are they tourists? You can kind of listen to the language that's being spoken, look and see how people dress, look and see, are these local people, are they foreigners? And I always try to spend most of my time at places that locals would eat. You're going to have a much better price, you're going to have much better food, and just a better experience overall. So the next thing that I like to do is to ask myself, where are the local people hanging out? Maybe it's a pub if you're somewhere in the UK, for example, or maybe it's in a cafe watching a soccer match or a football match. Maybe it's in a park, but look to see where people are at, what they're doing, and then also see if it's an option for you to kind of do the same thing. Don't just assume because people are doing it, you should do it. Kind of take notes of the gender, age, families, and general attitude of people that are around you, and just kind of make a determination of, is this an appropriate thing for me to blend in, to fit in to some extent, and it would be a good idea for me to take part of this. Now, if you start to try to become a local at a local place, it is going to be a little bit more challenging. A lot of the times those local places are less likely to speak a foreign language. So if you go to a tourist part of town, most likely to some extent they're going to speak English. However, the farther away you get from that, the less likely it is that people are going to speak anything besides their native language. Now, there's going to be some exceptions to that. English is pretty widely spoken, and so you might be able to find a local spot that has a couple of really great English speakers. But sometimes you might have to work a little bit harder if you want to have a local experience, you might need to be willing to be a little more vulnerable, to practice a foreign language a little bit. And so you might have to learn some of the language, or you might just have to be okay with using hand signals for help. Point to something on the menu, point to an amount, whatever the case may be. You need to use hand signals for help if people don't speak English. You have to be a little bit vulnerable, but most places appreciate you being there and appreciate any work that you put in to try to learn about their culture, learn a few words of their culture, of their language, even if you're bad at it. Now, there's a few exceptions to this. You can do your research beforehand. Most places, it's pretty easy to figure out whether or not they are appreciative of people trying to speak their language and to fit in, or if they're a little more hostile to that. You can figure that out for each individual place. But a lot of places really appreciate if you at least put some effort in to being less of a tourist and more culturally sensitive to wherever it is that you're going. Now, with that, do be prepared, because living like a local can definitely be hard at points and have some surprising side effects. You may end up with stomach issues. You may take a bus that is not the greatest ride ever. You may end up spending more time doing things than you are expecting to spend time doing those things. So there's all kinds of issues with that could arise if you have gone and eaten at a local place. Maybe your stomach is not used to the food that they're eating in that spot, and maybe it's going to mess you up for a little bit. Or maybe you take a bus ride and you think, what have I done with my life? This is awful. Or it might just be that as you're trying to spend time with someone, it might just be kind of awkward. I had a guy that I knew, local guy. He lived in the same building as me. And one day I was walking down the street and I saw him. He said, "Oh, come sit with me." So I sat with him, and the two of us sat there in silence for probably 20 minutes. I don't know that he said one word the entire time, because it was just a cultural thing to sit and spend time with someone. You didn't have to fill the silence. You were just spending time with each other. And so in that case, I sat with him for about 20 minutes, just sitting, watching the street, watching people walk by. And at the end of that time, I looked at him, said, "Hey, this has been very nice. I have something else on my schedule. I've got to get to my next event." He said, "Oh, thank you so much. This has been wonderful." And we separated ways. So just different ways of doing things that aren't necessarily expected. All of this is part of the experience and could turn into a great story depending on how it goes. Even if it's unpleasant at the time, it could be a great story one day and fond memories. We're going to talk about culture shock just a little bit. And first off, we're going to discuss, well, how do you spot culture shock? I sometimes personally prefer to call it cultural annoyance, because it feels less like a shock sometimes. And most of the time you're just annoyed with people, and you're annoyed with things that are going on around you. And usually if you start asking yourself, and if you hear yourself asking someone else, or just internally asking yourself, why don't they just whatever? Now, I say this because there have been times for me and other people that I know of where you don't always realize you are having this culture shock or this cultural annoyance, even if you are. I had a conversation with somebody one time, and they were like, "I don't have culture shock. It's just that I'm really annoyed by how they drive here. And I'm really annoyed that people always come up and talk to me. And I'm really annoyed that everything is loud all the time. And I'm really annoyed that I can't just go and do things like I'm used to doing." And as we were discussing this, it was like, well, this sounds like culture shock. And sometimes it takes someone else talking with you to actually realize, oh yeah, I do have this. This is something that's going on with me. And so if you don't have someone to bounce that off of with you, just always listen to yourself. And whenever you start to ask, why don't they just? That's probably a sign that you are starting to enter at least into cultural annoyance, if not full-on culture shock. Now, this might not be a thing if you're just going somewhere for a few days or a week. A lot of people don't get to the culture shock phase, and that's great. But just be aware that that is something that you might have to deal with, even if it's just a shorter trip. Now, how to deal with it? There's a lot of different ways that you can. It might be the type of thing where you just need a day to blow off some steam and do things like you do it at home. Find a restaurant that reminds you of something like home, find a coffee shop, whatever it is. Do be careful with that, though. You don't want to string several of these days together or wall yourself up, because ultimately you just have to push through the culture shock. If you build this bubble for yourself of living like you would in America or wherever your home is, you're never going to get through culture shock. You've just started living in a bubble. So appreciate the ways that the culture you're in is great. Acknowledge the ways it grates on you, just being aware of that. Remember, this culture is not out to get you. They aren't out to get you. They are just doing what they have done for hundreds, maybe thousands of years. And you are the new person that is seeing it differently. So learn how to cope in your own way with that. It might be the type of thing where you have gone through and you're realizing, hey, I went to the grocery store today and I waited in line. I waited for my turn. And as I went up to pay, a little old lady just cut in front of me, pushed her way in and threw her money down on the counter and cut me off. And that could be really annoying, but maybe that's culturally normal there. It might be the type of thing where you're driving somewhere and you think, well, why is this person cutting in front of me? Why are they just walking across the street? They're trying to get me to kill them. But really, that's just how people cross the street there. You don't know. You're not from that culture. So don't assume that this is the wrong way to do things. It is just different than the way that you are used to doing things. So remembering that in all of those things, the people aren't out to get you. There are just ways that cultures act and behave differently. Maybe it's perfectly normal to have a crowd of people around you because there's just a really high population density in that spot, and you have to elbow your way through the supermarket to get to the stuff you want. Maybe you're waiting in line and people crowd around you and just cut in front of you because they don't do lines there. So just figuring out what is normal, realizing when it starts to grate on you, and figuring out how to cope with cultural annoyances or that culture shock. So with all of the things we've discussed with entering a new culture and living like a local, above all else, I would recommend to be observant. Just see what's normal in that culture and within reason, replicate it. So there's going to be some things you're not going to do. You're not going to bring your old culture with you. You're not going to impose that on them, but you're also not going to completely shift into that new culture. You don't have to go native and act exactly like the people around you, but make some compromises, shift how you perceive things and do things to honor and respect that culture that you're going into. Thinking through, how can I adjust to this culture? What can I do that this culture does well? What can I take and learn from that? And then also keeping parts of who you are in the process of that. So while you don't have to go native, you do need to show respect for that culture. And even if you have studied beforehand, if you've done that prep work I've talked about, don't assume that you know things about that culture. Have ideas about it, but realize that just because you've read it and done the research, that might not be true in every case, might not be true at all times. It might be seasons of that. But looking around and seeing, hey, what are the people doing now? What is normal? What is culturally appropriate? And show the respect by observing that and honoring that. Once again, within reason, to be a good guest in this new culture that you have found yourself in. Finally, in all of these things, we've discussed entering into a new culture. We've discussed living like a local. I do want to throw in, there are some values in tourist places. They are usually touristy for a reason. There is cool stuff there. A lot of times, if I do, say, a week trip, I might give a day or two to doing tourist things. But there's so much that you will never learn about a culture, so much you will never experience about a culture if you don't leave the tourist areas and go to local places. So if I go someplace with a great tourist scene, I want to do that stuff. I want to give a little bit of time to that, but I also want the real experience to know, hey, this is what the real culture of this place is. So figure out beforehand how much tourist stuff you want to do. What are the must-sees and must-dos of this place? Commit a little bit of time to that, but then also figure out how much time you want to commit to doing local stuff. Kind of have a baseline plan before you even get into that culture, how much you want to mix and match that, and then stick to that plan. It's going to take work. It's not the easiest thing to do, but it is definitely worth it in the end, in my opinion, to be able to figure out and have a experience of a true local culture versus just spending all your time in the tourist areas. So I hope that has been helpful. I hope there's a few ideas of ways to get out and about, to see a new culture, to live like a local, and that you guys have enjoyed this, find it useful. And we will be back before too long with our next episode. But thank you guys for tuning in today, and hope you all have a great day.